talk about today was this notion of blurring lines in mediation. Some of you have heard about track 1, track 2 diplomacy, track 1 being the official diplomacy conducted by organizations like the UN, State Department, and foreign ministries, and then the unofficial track, which is conducted by individuals and or nonprofit NGOs who work in areas, usually problem-solving workshop kind of things, dialogue processes, or even quiet kind of back channel, behind the scenes mediation efforts. And so I'm interested in looking at what I think is a bit of a blurring of lines between these two tracks. Not that they've ever been actually tracks. There's always been permeation from one to the other. It's not like official track is only official and they don't ever talk to the unofficial group. But I think there's more going on now in terms of merging, maybe not merging is the right word, but more input from the official sector to the unofficial, and from the unofficial especially into the official track. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about the blurring of the lines in mediation. It's between some of the actors involved in mediation. And I will, it's interesting because I think this blurring of the lines has some positive benefits, but I also think there are some dangers involved with this as well that we need to be aware of, especially perhaps those of us in the unofficial sector who stand to benefit the most, but also who stand to lose a lot, I think. Mediation has been a very sexy field to be in. People all think that mediation is like glory, and it's noble, and it's fabulous, and it is and it isn't, because a lot of it is, a lot of it is feeling like you're completely in over your head. But to quote my favorite poet, or one of my favorite poets, T.S. Eliot, he said, "If you're not in over your head, how do you know how tall you are?" So I kind of feel like, okay, most of the time we're in over our heads. It's a very difficult area to be in. Mediation is a tough field. Usually there's very little glory, and most of the work is not at the table. 95% of what you do in mediation is not mediation. It's all the preparatory work. It's all the research. It's all the investigations into knowing what the issues are, understanding the issues. So it's a lot of the work is not this sexy stuff that you see where with John Kerry shaking hands with Zarif, getting a deal on Iran. That's the tip of the iceberg. Those talks have been going on for years. And so why people want to do this, I don't know. Chet Crocker and Finn Osler Hampson, Pamela All, in their book, Taming Intractable Conflicts, they have edited a whole bunch of books in this field that are great. They say the mediator's challenge is to lead the parties to places where they do not want to go in order to talk about what they do not want to discuss with interlocutors they do not want to recognize. What do you think, Robert?
Sounds good to me.
Pretty accurate. Yeah. So it's a tough area to be in, and one of the issues is is it better to have all different perspectives? Is it better to have more input between these two tracks so that everyone has the advantage of the information that comes from being an official mediator and the advantage that comes from being an official? So I thought first I would maybe just give you a little background of who mediates, who actually mediates in these things. Mediators, for the most part, tend to be diplomats. They tend to be government officials or former government officials. They tend to be people who have no mediation background. They might be very skilled negotiators, but negotiation is not the same as mediation. So somebody who can negotiate on behalf of their organization or their country may be very good at doing that, but it's a very different skill than mediating. Mediating requires you stepping back, and it requires you actually listening to others. And your point of view is not necessarily the most important point of view to be put on the table. You're there to try to help them come to some agreement that is viable, that is fair, and conventions. So mostly it's people who are doing this because they've achieved high-level positions in governments or in intergovernmental organizations like the UN, the African Union. And it's a crowded area. There's a lot of mediation going on. Increasingly, there's mediation going on at the official level that's not just political. Robert mentioned this, focusing on military and humanitarian. Yeah. And a lot of mediation going on now is really done by a lot of these UN people who are not political people. They are the people in charge of getting a humanitarian aid convoy through, one side of the war or another side. And they need to get it through that area to get to the other people. And so often parties in conflict want to block humanitarian aid. So a lot of people on the ground are actually doing mediation, even though they might not consider it that. They just may consider that's their job. The peacekeeping commanders are constantly mediating in order to get ceasefires, safe corridors, all this kind of thing. And they're official actors. They're acting on behalf of their official status. But because there's so many mediators involved, and conflicts are becoming more complex, especially as they become more regional in focus and not just within a country, you have kind of a proliferation of mediators. And just to give you kind of an example from a while ago, in the case of Bosnia, there were 9 mediators at any given time. And the 9 mediators were the 5 members, there were 5 countries that were part of the contact group: the US, the UK, Russia, France, and Germany. So you had the 5 representatives from the contact group. Then you had the representatives of the Secretary General. You had the general in charge of the peacekeeping operations. You had the 2 mediators on behalf of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So one of the calls we got at the Carter Center during the war in Bosnia was from the office of the president of Bosnia, saying, could you guys please send somebody out here, because we don't know who we're supposed to be talking to. They said, we'll get the German ambassador coming to talk to us, and we think we've agreed on something with the contact group, with the 5-nation group. Then the next thing we know is the UK ambassador is here and proposing something different, and we're not sure. So could you help us figure out who it is that we're supposed to be talking to? Which was really depressing, but that was 1994. We are now 20 years down the road, and the situation has not improved. There needs to be a lead on these teams. You can have multiple mediators, but there has to be an agreement on who is actually leading the mediation. And that sometimes, most of the time that does happen, but every now and again it doesn't. And it creates a real problem with the mediation, with official mediations. I must say, in unofficial, this doesn't happen because the context is very different. At the moment, most of the mediators that we have at the official level are men. We have very few women who are special representatives of the Secretary General to conflict zones. We have a few, but I think we're better off than we were 5 years ago. This Secretary General has certainly done probably more than any other Secretary General we've had to increase the promotion of women within the UN system and to bring in women. Yeah, that's quite good. So the other people who mediate are unofficial actors, and that is the people from Track 2 organizations, NGOs, etc. But they're also insiders. So what you also get are people who are inside the conflict who just have had it and who have positions of some influence within their societies. Even if they are known to be biased towards one side or another, they are so respected by the community that they are accepted as a mediator. And so this kind of mediation goes on all the time, but it doesn't have much international visibility. And often when international mediators come in from the official sector, they don't know that these people are doing this work. And so they don't benefit from, building on what's being done, either at the community level or nationally. for example, there's a woman, a lawyer in the Philippines. She's Filipino, and she went up to Mindanao, and she started mediating with her. There was like a women's lawyers group, and they had like an affiliate in Mindanao, and so she was meeting with them, and they were telling her what the issues were. So she and some of these women went to mediate with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, one of these rebel terrorist groups, and they got an agreement to allow a safe corridor of passage so that people could safely travel, kids could go to school, people could harvest. And then they went to the government to get the government to sign on to this. The government refused to sign on to it. After about, I don't know how long, somebody can probably Google this and get more accurate information, but I think it's called the Bantai ceasefire. And after a few years, the government saw that it was working, and they actually joined in. And then they formed a monitoring group to monitor the ceasefire that was made up of the government, of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and of this group of women and civil society. And they were part of this monitoring group. This ceasefire has failed on several occasions, but it has always come back. And so it is still in existence today, and I think it's at least 10 years, we're probably close to 10 years down the road with this happening. So mediation is occurring that's not necessarily visible to those of us on the outside. And it's very important mediation. As I get older and not necessarily wiser, I wish. But I do think that these efforts of people within conflicts are really critical and really important, and more important probably than many of our outside efforts. If they're allowed to work and if their lives are not put at risk, these people do put their lives at risk to do this work. So it's quite dangerous. So they're doing more of that. Now what's happening in terms of the blurring of the lines is that what we're finding, like at the UN, about 7 years ago, the UN created a mediation support unit because they realized that they did not have the kind of expertise in peacemaking that is the fundamental mission of the UN. And that while they talked about peace and they deployed people, they didn't actually know much about the field or about conflict resolution. So they created a unit to bring in more expertise. And they have brought in a lot of young professionals with degrees in peace studies, conflict resolution, with a specific focus on helping in mediation efforts at the UN. And then they created the standby team of mediation experts, which I was privileged to be on for the first year. And every year they hire a new team. It's a one-year kind of gig that they bring in about 5 or 6 or 7 people to be deployed quickly to areas that need assistance. And we all come from the unofficial. We come from academia, from practice, from wherever. And so there we are, very much inserted into an official process, but we are not official. And I think this is happening more. The government of Norway, as well as I think Finland, Switzerland, they all now are in some way capitalizing on the knowledge of think tanks and or conflict resolution organizations, often within their own countries, but sometimes not, to provide them with not only information, but with actually doing conflict analyses and having that input into the official track. So I see that there's more kind of blending of the official and unofficial sectors in that way. And of course, that in the unofficial sector, we have a lot of former diplomats who come into universities or who come into think tanks and NGOs. And so it's going in both directions in that way. So at any rate. So in terms of now, that's the mediation. That's what happens with the mediator level. In terms of who's at the table, well, the table is reserved still today for the official parties. So you don't have a reservation if you come from civil society. No seat at the table here. But that's not completely accurate anymore. And there is more and more pressure on mediators to to observe a UN Security Council resolution that was passed 15 years ago, UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which stipulates that women must be part of every single aspect of a peace process, from prevention to resolution to peace building, everything. And this has been taken seriously by Ban Ki-moon, interestingly. I would have expected it of Kofi Annan, but didn't happen. Ban Ki-moon has made quite a lot of inroads there, and the organization UN Women has been very active in this. It's not an organization, it's part of the UN. So now it is incumbent on anyone mediating on behalf of the UN, or for some governments who have also taken this very seriously in their foreign policy, which is the inclusion of women. The inclusion of women not just as part of a mediation team, but the inclusion of women at the table who represent the people of the country and/or who represent the political sides. In one of the mediations, actually two of the mediations I took part in on the standby team, one was on Somalia, one was on the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in both cases, the head mediator, who was, I think they were there for show, because they were there to represent, to basically make the mediator happy. The mediator had stipulated they wanted women at the table, so who knows, these could have been their wives, their mistresses, their sisters, their daughters, a relative, who knows who they were. The women were always seated at the end of the table, furthest away from the mediation team, so my assumption was that they were, in fact, the least important on the team, otherwise they would have been seated closer up. But there is a beginning acceptance of having a little gender inclusion, even if it is not, we're nowhere near parity at this point in terms of who's at the table. Who else is at the table are representatives of civil society. Now, they're not always at the table. A lot of these people end up in the kitchen, if you forgive the metaphor. I think I've got this in my head because tomorrow my discussion with the Democracy Fellows is, I've titled it Who Cooks Peace and What Ingredients Go Into It. So I'm thinking cuisine. Plus I have a very good friend who teaches at American University, and she's teaching a course on conflict cuisine, which is, it's been written about a bit. It's a very interesting course on how different diasporas come to bring things. So at any rate, so we are getting more of people participating. During the Kenya talks following the violence, the electoral violence in 2007, 2008, Kofi Annan, who was then the lead mediator on that, Kofi Annan, with a very good staff supplied by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a nonprofit based in Geneva. Kofi Annan, with being completely staffed by them, they argued that he should have an open door policy one day a week to meet with Kenyan civil society and to hear their views on what the process was doing. And so that's what he did. And he had an open door once a week, and anyone could come in, any Kenyan could come in to talk about how they felt the process was going, what they wanted him to do, where there were problems, etc. So he was getting that input. So at least some of this is starting to happen. I think it probably always has happened, but it's becoming a little more visible, and it's becoming a little more routinized with some of the kind of norms of the inclusion. And there's also an understanding that if you want a peace agreement to be sustainable, then you really have to have the people at the table who know how to make peace and build peace. Because the people at the table, who are the warring parties, know how to make war. But they have actually never run any kind of democratic organization. And they have never actually been working on construction. They've not been building things. They've been tearing down things. So they've been saying no. They're good at saying no, but it's not easy to say yes. So the idea is have people at the table who can say yes. Mediators are recognizing that these non-traditional actors, women, youth, civil society organizations, are their allies because they can help them push the warring factions to do some things in terms of agreements that might have more chance of being viable Have any of you seen the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell? Okay. Pray the Devil Back to Hell, if you have a chance to see it, is a wonderful film of the Liberian women's struggle for peace. And it basically has some very interesting lessons in there about advocacy for peace, but also about how the mediator actually dealt with the women. The women barricaded the conference room. The men could not get in or out. The women would not allow the warring factions to leave the building. They physically blocked the building, and so the mediator recognized, smart enough, this was a UN-AU mediator, I believe, or ECOWAS, maybe. And he recognized it, and he saw the women as his ally. And even though they were, doing something that he didn't view as too helpful because the men couldn't get to the bathroom, he understood what they were doing, and he understood that there was a real issue at hand, which is while these warring factions were in cushy hotels in Ghana, they were actually launching new strikes. And so anyway, so he viewed them as allies, and he actually started talking to them and finding out what were they hearing, because he wasn't necessarily hearing the same things. So information sharing is also very, very helpful and useful. So to move on to the issue of, okay, this blurring of lines, blessing or curse, is a good thing, bad thing? Well, of course, like everything, it's a little mixed. So I'm going to deal with the curses first, only because I like to end on a happier note. So, one of the things is mediation, I think, and some of you can correct me if you think that I'm wrong, and I would like to hear from you, because I'm not sure if the lines are really blurring, or whether it's just that now we know so much more about these processes, because we see them, we hear about them, but, and I don't know whether mediations are getting more complicated. It seems to me they are, because we have so many non-state actors, and we have people we don't know. We're not sure if they represent the people they say they represent. So sometimes it isn't clear that the people we actually have at the table are actually the ones who can make the decision. And sometimes we can't get those people to the table. And here I think of Joseph Kony, who some of you may have heard about. Joseph Kony in northern Uganda has refused really to talk to people for most of the time he's been fighting, which is now going on more than 25 years now, 1987, something like that. He's been in the bush fighting and abducting his own people, killing his own people. A few of us have met with him, but not a lot of people have met with him. And he won't even come to talk. It's very hard to get him to come to the table. Then you have other people who might come to the table, but who don't represent who you think they are. It used to be, I think, clear cut, where you really you knew who was in charge of the government, you knew who was in charge of the opposition factions. And I think so now that complicates things. Who are really the key people that you have to have in order to make peace? Plus, you have much more regional involvement, as I said, so that it's a lot of different countries involved. And they all have their own interests, so their interests are not necessarily those of peace. So that's another difficulty. There's also the competition between unofficial and official mediators. Sometimes there are clashes in the way they go about doing their work. One of the other curses is a silent participant in the talks. And the silent participant in every talk, in every mediation that goes on today, is the cell phone. There is no longer any possibility that any mediation or peace process is private. The Somali parties at the table with the mediator in the room were sitting there texting exactly everything that was going on in that room, and they were sending it back so that people in Somalia knew what was happening within minutes of it happening. Which then means that they're getting instructions. They may be getting instructions from home about what to do and what not to do. So they may have been ready to actually make some progress, and then they're getting feedback. Now the feedback could be, go ahead, push, you want this. Or, no, you're not getting this, and this, so don't do this. It could also be that what frequently happens is people make statements quickly that they later regret and they can't take back. So one of the parties to the conflict could write something about how intransigent the other side is and they're not willing to do this or this, and then the next day the party's willing to do that, but it's hard for you to step back. Or they're not willing to do it, but then you realize you need to work with them anyway, and then you've already garnered ill will towards the other party from all your constituents at home. So this is something we never had to deal with before. There was a certain sanctity to confidentiality. And the issue of confidentiality, this is one of the, I think, the curses. It's really difficult to do a mediation when you have maybe millions of people watching over your shoulder. You don't know. So that's, the social media is amazing, and you'd be amazed who's on Facebook. Well, you know. I mean, ISIS, I mean, everybody has a Facebook page and, Twitter accounts, and yeah, so, all of this, it just makes life much more difficult. The other thing is that the more people you include in the process, the more unwieldy it becomes, and it is difficult. Again, in Somalia, many years ago, they tried to have a very inclusive process with all the clans. They built a special structure to hold 2,000 people for the peace talks. That didn't go anywhere. Big surprise. But the impetus to be inclusive is a good one. So the question is, how do we be inclusive? And I think for those of us in this field, I think we need to be doing, research and looking at how do we be inclusive, but maximize the opportunities to get an effective agreement. And does this inclusivity, in fact, help us to get there? I think it does, but in some ways, it's just a lot more complicated. And the word conflict management is a really good word because basically all of this is management. You're managing a very unwieldy process. So sorry, blessings quickly. The good side about the blurring of lines, and there is such a blurring of lines, and I would be happy to hear whether you would agree that there is or isn't. I think the good side is that there's more transparency in all of this. I think we know more about what goes on in some of these processes, and this is due in part to social media. Another good thing is that this allows people on the ground to know really what's happening and to hold their leaders accountable, and I think that's good. So they know that their leaders are spending 2 weeks at a luxury hotel and they haven't done anything. So it allows them to push their leaders. So I think that's a positive thing. Another thing is that there's, I think there's better information provided to both the official and unofficial tracks by blending with each other a little more. Another thing that's happened is I think there is more mediation expertise coming into mediation, so that I think there is more of a willingness on the part of some diplomats and some special envoys and mediators to accept information and advice from some of us who are in this field and to help them. And I think they're willing to accept that. Others will never be able to do that, and it's a kind of a delicate thing when you're trying to advise a former head of state on, what he or she might be, setting up a mediation to fail right from the get-go. Anyway, and also there's been more cooperation with states and with the intergovernmental organizations and NGOs. I think across the board there's been a lot more back and forth between these fields, so they're not quite so cut and dry. There's been better recognition of the importance and inclusion of women in civil society in these processes, partly due to UN Resolution 1325, partly due also, I think, to the International Criminal Court, to the coming into effect of the Rome Statute. I think that has brought a lot more discussion on human rights issues and on what people can and can't do, and on having advisors coming in to talk to mediators about what can be agreed and what can't be agreed. There have been UN mediators who've refused to sign a peace agreement because they felt it violated basic human rights principles. So I think this kind of expertise is very important. And then the question is, does this provide
an example of that? An example of UN mediators not signing a peace agreement because it violates IPPF?
case, actually, and of course I'm blanking on it right now. It happened, this happened, I'm trying to think if this was Darfur. It could have been on Darfur.
It's fascinating, the tensions between the.
Well, mediators are not neutral. This is why I often argue, I don't believe in neutrality for mediators, because neutrality implies you have no particular values. And I think that for a mediator to agree to a peace agreement, like the one that was agreed in Bosnia, is appalling, because the one that was agreed in Bosnia was, rather than everybody reducing the number of arms to the level of the Bosnian army, they decided to up all the arms in the region to the level of the Serb army. So I mean, to me, that's kind of like, really? That's, you know, at that point, I think, you know, the mediator cannot impose his or her views, but I think at least to question this and to try to seriously look at alternatives. I'll try to think about it and look. There is, the UN has a website called UN Peacemaker. They have all the peace agreements on there. And I think actually if you Google something like, you know, like SRSG did not sign peace agreement, or, I mean, today it's so incredible. Anyway, so that's why I'm hopeful that this is going to be advantageous. The final thing that I neglected to put in the negative side is I am very concerned about the independence of the unofficial organizations in working with official organizations. Because to date, the NGOs, especially in the US, I think we have been very independent. We don't work for governments. In Norway, the relationship of some of the conflict organizations are much closer to the government of Norway, who funds them. And the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, although based in Geneva, receives most of its funding from the government of Norway. And it is still independent, but some of the conflicts it deals with are those that Norway is interested in having dealt with. And so, not that they're not ones that are worthy of it, because they tend to be ignored conflicts. They tend to be conflicts that the US and other major powers are not that interested in. But that's a big issue for the NGO world, is, are we going to be giving up our independence to work with the Track 1 actors? And is there a way to do that? So, thank you. I'm happy to take questions and figure out if this notion of blurring lines is accurate or not accurate. Questions? Please.
So you said most of the work was about researching and understanding beforehand.
Yes.
Can you just talk about what that looks like and how you get the information you need? I mean, are you the one who directly goes to talk to groups? Do you like read papers that they've written, or do you send somebody else who might connect with them better? Or
Yeah. My experience is just my experience, because I'm sure that other people in this field, I mean, I think we all use some of the similar tools, but we probably all do it a little differently. I mean, there's certain things, at the beginning, if I don't know a conflict, for example, I'll even do something like go online and look at the BBC history of the conflict, the chronology of the conflict. Then I'll try to find out, like, who are all the parties to the conflict. Now that we have the internet, this is, fabulous, because you can get a lot of information there, but you don't know how accurate it is, and Wikipedia is fabulous, but again, you don't know how accurate it is. So then once you know a little bit, you're not going to look like a complete idiot if you make a phone call to, a regional, then you start calling scholars and experts. I mean, that would be my thing, but I wouldn't want to call them until I knew what questions I wanted to ask, and I don't know what questions I want to ask until I do a little bit of research. I really like reading anthropological articles of countries and some histories, because I think, a conflict today is a conflict often that has its roots way back. Or that really doesn't, but the leaders are manipulating the conflict to make you think it goes way back. Ancient hatreds, that's easy excuse. That's not often true, but anyway, but it does relate to something in the psyche of the people. It's a, as Vomit Volkan, we were talking about, as Vomit Volkan would say, it's a chosen trauma. And so, so you can mobilize these traumas of, 600 years ago. But But you wanna know this, you wanna know this kind of stuff. So then you start calling, you look up, you know, who follows, you know, who's following Syria? Who's working on Syria right now? And, you know, you might go to the usual suspects in terms of think tanks and start making phone calls. One of the things that I have found, which has been really, I mean, incredible, is how generous people are. These people who know and who've been following conflicts and studying them. I don't know if I've ever found anyone who did not want to talk about it. I mean, they're very willing to engage, and they're willing to share their knowledge with you. I mean, you have to ask, you know, you have to do the call right. You have to be courteous, and you don't call and expect them to talk to you then and there. You can say, you know, I'd like to talk about this. Can you give me, you know, is there any time when you might have a few minutes to talk to me about it? So you don't expect them to drop everything, you know, it's like setting up a meeting. So you talk to them. If you have the luxury of a little bit of funding, then you also try to bring people together, and you have a strategy meeting. And you bring people together in a room like this with experts, with conflict resolution people, together with regional experts, and you start talking about what's doable. What could be done, and who is best suited to do it, because it may not be you. And you have to know it's not gonna be you, and that's okay. And especially if you're an NGO, you don't have to be involved. If you're the UN, you have no choice. Seriously, you know, after everybody else fails, the UN is gonna have to be involved. But most of us who don't work for the UN, we have the option, especially in the unofficial track, we choose where we're going to be engaged. And so you have the luxury of a little bit of time to do this kind of background check, and you also have the luxury of deciding not to get engaged once you have the information. And that's a difficult choice, but it's, you know, you have to know who else is doing things. You also want to know every peace process that's gone on and why they failed. So, I mean, there's a lot of this kind of stuff. So you're basically talking, you're reading. What else are you doing? What am I missing here from some of you folks who know this? What am I missing with this? And if you can go into the field, yeah, I mean, if you can go into the country first, if you can make a visit and meet people and talk to people. I've done quite a few conflict assessments, and one of the most interesting I ever did was a few years ago, the Central African Republic, for the UN, and this was the UN Development Program, and they were so incredibly well organized. They hired 2 local consultants to work with me, so I could get access to people I would never have access to, nor them. So I met with the head of the taxi and bus drivers union in the country. Unbelievable, unbelievable. They shut down the entire country when they were protesting police corruption. Shut down the whole country because people don't have cars in CAR, so they all depend on buses and taxis. So to prevent them from being, so anyway, so you discover power in different sectors. It's like they have power. Then I met with the Muslim Widows Association. And you know, this is what we do when you go out and you talk to people and you find out what do they think are the issues in the country. Do they think the country is on the path to peace? Do they see signs? What signs are they seeing? How does that impact them? You meet with political parties, all this, and you do all of that, yeah. And that's usually what you would do before you would start a project. And most donors, and so you're doing this on your own dime, by the way. And this is very difficult now. I mean, when I started working at the Carter Center in '92, we were getting general funding. We were getting funding from Carnegie, from MacArthur, and it was general funding. We could use it for this kind of stuff. About 5 years later, that funding was changing to program funding. So we couldn't use, you know, and now the world is really different in terms of funding, and it's very hard to have the kind of funds available to do this kind of homework before you actually apply for a grant for the work. So, I mean, it makes life much harder to do this kind of research and work, and yeah, so, but that's kind of what goes into the assessment. And the UN and official organizations may not have the time or the funds to do any of this. The UN, I must say, I was a little bit appalled by the desk officers when I was asked to go to a place, often with not a lot of notice. And I would have to deal with getting a visa, getting getting shots or doing, getting my Malarone prescription, doing all this kind of, getting a doctor's appointment to get the Malarone prescription, I mean, all this stuff in like 2 days. And so I didn't have a lot of time to be sitting there trying to get information, and I would call the UN desk. And I would say, can you send me like just basic stuff? Who are the parties? I don't know who the parties are, because we weren't sent to places that we necessarily knew. So I didn't know anything about Somalia. I mean, I knew something about Somalia, and I had followed it a bit, but I didn't really know who the parties were and the names, and who was I gonna be in the room with? No clue. So I asked for her to send me some information. She sent me an article from like Life magazine from about 5 years earlier about a background on Somalia. I mean, I was appalled. And I called her and I said, don't you have any, memos or do you have like, do you have any links you look at online? If you just send me your links, then I can do that. No, nothing. And that was typical of most of our deployments. Many of us went out without any knowledge. And that is, they're understaffed, they're very understaffed, and they're overworked. The same people who were working on the Democratic Republic of Congo peace process, I saw in Djibouti for the Somalia peace talks. Those same 2 men I then saw in Kenya working on post-electoral violence in Kenya. So Kenya, Somalia, DRC, the same 2 guys staffing those mediations because they were very good. They were very good. But it's the UN needs a little more money. So, yes.
My question is, so it sounds like a lot of the work you do is more of the in the moment, resolving sort of a crisis thing, like a conflict happening in the moment. But I want to know more about like what work does, or how does your work involve more long-term solutions, like impacting maybe the structural or cognitive or other parts of a conflict that aren't really immediate, let's cease the fire, but like,
Yes.
how does that play into the work that you do or work that mediators do?
It doesn't. I think when there's a hot fire burning, then what you're doing is really trying to put the fire out in many cases. So that's, I think, what you mean by the in the moment mediation. So I think to some extent you're just trying to get you're trying to basically achieve a humanitarian goal of saving lives. But I think that is the strength of the Track 2 level. I think that's where Track 2 comes in as particularly strong and useful, which is dealing with these issues of deep-seated kind of mistrust, of dealing with past humiliations, of feelings of inadequacy, of feelings where you go into a world that's highly emotional and not as rational. So you're going to do anything against the other, even if it's bad for you, because you just want to get at the other. I think Track 2 processes that look at long-term relationship building, trust building, and often not overtly so. Often you don't bring people together to say we're going to try to make you like each other, because that's not the point. The point is not to make them like each other. If they always hate each other, it's okay. The point is that you're trying to help them understand each other. You're trying to help them understand that you have some shared interests and shared goals. You don't have to become bosom buddies. I mean, one of the mistakes of a lot of these efforts is that you see people eating together and you go, oh, those 2 who hate each other, they're sitting together and eating dinner. Well, yeah, they can eat dinner together and be very nice, and then the next day they can pick up guns and shoot each other. But, in my early days in this field, I remember a couple of occasions where people were going, oh, look, those men are washing dishes together. We were at a retreat, and it was on Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh. And so we were kind of way up in the woods in Northern California. And so we were all washing, we all had turns of washing the dishes and making dinner and that kind of thing. And so some of my colleagues were saying, look, they're washing dishes together. And I was like, yeah, wow, that's pretty cool. So that's great. Because it must mean, they're standing and talking and it's really good. Well, they're standing and washing dishes together because that was the environment. And that's what kind of was expected, it didn't mean anything long-term. So the long-term thing for a lot of track-through processes, dialogue, is really to help people share very difficult things emotionally. And to let them know. A quick example from the work I did with Vomit Volkan and Hal Saunders. Hal Saunders was a former Assistant Secretary of State who helped negotiate the Camp David Accords, and Hal, I think, also worked, if I'm not mistaken, on the hostage. He also worked on the hostage crisis under President Carter in Iran. And then Vomit Volkan, psychoanalyst, psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who has done a lot of work on kind of psychopolitical processes. We did a project in Estonia, a conflict prevention project. And you know Estonia?
Or I know Estonia.
Okay, yeah, okay, good. You've been there?
Yeah.
You live there?
No, just travel.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, at any rate, we were doing this project on Estonia, and as you know, there is great antipathy between the ethnic Russian population and the ethnic Estonian population. So in one of our little meetings, we've been meeting with the same group of people for about a year, and in this little group, small group, because we divided into small groups, in small group, Vomit says to the Estonians, so if I understand you correctly, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you would just as soon see all the Russians exterminated. Is that correct? And I'm sitting there with my heart like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Oh my God! You know, I'm, you know, and the response was, do you know what they responded? How would the Estonians? They've just been asked if they would just as soon prefer all Russians to be exterminated. The response was silence. No response. No response. I had expected them to say, well, of course not, even though, you know, no, there was nothing. So then I'm thinking, well, how does Vomit salvage this? Because to raise this kind of emotional ante this high, you have to be able to deal with it, which I'm not skilled to do. I would never do that because I don't know how to handle what happens after that. But he was able to deal with it and to be able to show the Estonians, to show the Russians how deeply the Estonians resented the Russian occupation of Estonia during, after World War II, because they had been independent between the wars. And so the Russians, so it was this awareness building. So it was dealing very much with this kind of emotional, of changing the way they thought about this, because they saw themselves as the aggrieved party. And then they could see that Estonians were also, but it was a safe environment in which to do this. And this was a 3-year process. At the end of the 3-year process, one of our very, very staunch Russian Estonian men who refused to learn Estonian, didn't want anything to do with Estonia, he shared with us that his daughter had passed the citizenship test and was becoming an Estonian citizen, and that he was enrolled in Estonian language courses. Now, to us, is that a success for us? Yes, it was. Were we responsible for it? I have no clue. There might have been a lot of other reasons for it. You never know. But we were very pleased that there were things like this that were happening, and I think that addresses kind of that side, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And on the laws and all that kind of side, not as effective in terms of changing. The Estonians, yeah, well, they were very young in their work. They got rid of all the older people when they became independent. So the prime minister was 31 years old, and they made some mistakes. Like he signed a treaty that violated the Estonian constitution, but he wasn't familiar with the Estonian constitution. So they had to go back and redo it. But very smart.
A question about sort of blurring the lines and sort of the efficacy you see from that, if you're seeing any effects. I'm kind of looking at a similar thing with international human rights promotion at the UN, and it seems like when...
Please feel free, if you need to run, please feel free to go. But thank you for coming, I really appreciate it. I hope it was useful, interesting. Thank you.
So, when the UN or other official actors bring these civil society groups in, it tends to help bolster the legitimacy of the proceedings,
Yes.
sometimes, but without really changing the outcome of what the state-led or official-led process would have been.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're seeing similar sort of like token inclusion
Yes.
or what your
Yes, I
thoughts are
think,
on that.
yeah, I think you're right. I think we're still at the beginning stages, and I would agree, sometimes it's more window dressing to satisfy the various constituencies, including women's inclusion, as I mentioned before. I mean, some of it is clearly window dressing, just to make people, feel like they've ticked that box. And some of it is more, I think, because in some cases, I think the unofficial people become so mobilized that even if it's not at the table or in the room, that they then go on to feel that there is at least a channel for them to work with, and that maybe they can pursue their agenda, maybe not in a public forum, but maybe more privately, that they have made contacts with people so they can share information, which might then be absorbed more willingly if it's not blatantly the idea from the, the other. So I think these are useful connections. It's just like the inclusion of women. Right now, a lot of what we talk about with women and gender is, inclusion. But inclusion of women does not mean that we've included gender. Because just because there are men in the room doesn't mean we've included gender. We don't all know what makes for a gender agreement. I mean, can I give you a quick anecdote? This whole thing about gender, I thought I knew something about this, and when I was in Cyprus doing this series of meetings and trying to work with women to get them, they were being used actually. The UN put together what we call the technical advisory group for the mediation of women, and the women were drafting language for the agreement that was gender sensitive. They were a very educated group from the Turkish Cypriot and the Greek Cypriot side, and really working well, and academics and activists. But when I met with the mayor of Nicosia, so I thought I knew something about gender, and I go to meet with the mayor of Nicosia, and I don't know why the UN has set up this meeting for me. It's like when I first get to the country and I'm meeting with this mayor, and so she welcomes me and tells me, and I ask her a little bit about some of the issues in the city, what's she dealing with, and what are the issues. And she said, parking is a real problem in the old city. And she said, now you'd be interested in that because that's a gender issue. And I'm thinking, okay, parking, that I don't get. So she said, well, she said, in the old city, the space is so limited that our parking spaces are very tight. And she said, it's usually the women who have the babies and the children. They have to get out of the car. They can't get the babies out of the car because they can't open the doors. They can't open the doors enough to get the kids out. And she said, so we've had to change all the parking spaces in the old city so that all the parking spaces allow you to open the back doors of the cars. So I thought, boy, if that's a gender issue, what isn't a gender issue? I mean, that was new. But anyway, so I mean, I'm hopeful that this kind of merging, or not merging, but just becoming aware of each other, and the fact that they're now aware that we exist in the unofficial community is already progress. So you're way ahead in human rights. You are way ahead of us, I think. Partly because it comes out of a legal framework, and we don't.
I have a question. You talked about the train to track too, and I was thinking, on a macro level, what could promote this trend structurally? And so my question back to you is, to what extent does it have to do with the splintering up of state power, or the trend in these conflict areas towards dysfunctional states, where you lack a political entity that manages to integrate, and then you have almost
in Somalia, from what I understand, and some of you may know Somalia better, but from what I understand, they have managed to function amazingly well with really a completely failed state. They have trash removal, they have schools, they are functioning, and it's not through any government. And in many of these societies, you're right, it is people who are, organizing and providing for basic health services, delivery, and all of that. And we're doing great work in trying to bridge the divide between the communities. So,
So it's almost a natural for the UN to resort to them, because there is no belief that
But
you
they're
integrate
not so-
enough.
no, you're right, and this is one of the dilemmas, which is that these people who may be really well known, some of them might be quite well known within their community, are not on the radar of most of these official organizations. So you don't know that, Mohammed from, the fourth arrondissement, quartier, or whatever you want to call it, or whatever country you're in, I don't know. They won't know that Mohammed is the guy to go to if you want to know, all about health delivery services, and that he's the one who's been organizing this or that. They don't appear on the scope, and that's where, in some ways, I think some of our development organizations do a much better job in knowing who's on the ground than the political side.
Which kind of relates to a joke that went around Europe. What's the definition of a family in Bosnia? It's one or two parents, one or two kids and two NGOs.
Yes. Because there were so many of them.
There was no state.
Yeah. Oh, I see, that's why, because I thought, oh boy, after the war ended, every single
Right.
NGO in the world flooded to Bosnia.
Right. Of course, there was a lot of incentive for NGOs to become active, but at the same time, you have not resolved the issue about integrating
Yes.
units of negotiation and state units of power, so which kept the system fractionalized and still is fractionalized too much.
It is. I don't know, am I addressing your question?
Yes.
Robert, do you want to add anything? Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and I wish that the official track would actually, that's what I was mentioning before with inside mediators, people who are on the ground doing a lot of this work. They just don't seem to be very visible. It's hard to get them included, but I think it's starting, it's just starting. And especially in these places that are, Syria, why are we looking to the same old kinds of people who haven't brought peace anywhere to bring peace here? I don't know.
Right. Then I had a kind of a fantasy. Let's take the Russian and Arctic resources, etc. fight. So Greenpeace is articulating the conflict, amazingly strong. So and they may not be tolerated, let's say, on certain national grounds because they articulate so much. But then they could almost like double track, have specialized negotiators or mediators, not negotiators, and articulate, and at the same time specialize in mediating, not negotiating. Have you come across a case like this?
I don't think so.
Right.
No. Interesting. Yeah.
Kind of a constellation.
It would be, yeah.
Because states do that all the time. They are at war. At the same time, they have, let's say, people of confidence that they can send to other parties to mediate, negotiate and or mediate. And so that would be Greenpeace as an NGO doing the same thing, being at war and mediate at the same time.
Yes,